Thank you for joining us for the 8th lecture in our Muharram series. My name is Kaniz Sivji, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Organization for Islamic Learning. The Organization for Islamic Learning, or OIL, is a charitable, nonprofit, community-based group that strives to build a membership whose main goal is to understand and practice the essence of Islam in an inclusive environment. We promote learning activities based on the teachings of the Quran and the values of its prophet and his family. OIL is a registered charity, and as such, we depend on your donations to continue our programs. Every little bit helps, and we can provide donation receipts for any amount above $25. We are accepting donations via our website, islamiclearning.org. We'll be having a Q&A session after the lecture. Questions can be submitted through Menti. The code is 25365869. Please note that this code is valid from now until the end of the lecture series, even when we are not live. We would like to start the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Kazim Rizvi and follow that by a Mursha by Mohsin Bala.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wal asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. By time, indeed, mankind is in loss, except for those who have believed and done righteous deeds and advised each other to truth and advised each other to patience. Thank you.
Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. We are commemorating today one of the most celebrated martyrs and family members of Imam Hussain, Hazrat Abul Fadl al-Abbas alayhi salam. His personality and story just rings of valor, bravery, sacrifice, and just loyalty that is unmatchable. Alhamdulillah. I'm going to present with you some verses and poems to remember this great, brave soldier of Islam. And what better way to remember his bravery than, instead of lamenting and crying, but to send him salutations. Nehre al-Qamar Nehre al-Qamar Tu sach bata کیا ہوئے عباس سے علمدار، عباس سے علمدار، ام البنی کے چاند، شبیر کے بازو، کیا خوب وفائی کی، کٹوا کے دونوں بازو، اسلام کا یہ دامن تو نے بھر دیا وفا سے، سقائے تیری سقا، تا حشر ہم نہ بھولے، اے با وفا علمدار، ہمارا سلام لو، زینب پکاری بھیا، کیا بھائی کو ہے کھویا، شہ بولے بھائی عباس، دریا بسا کے سویا، زہرا کا لخت دلبر یوں خون میں ہے لیٹا، حیدر کا جانے قرار، ہمارا سلام لو، آیا ہے علم اور علمدار آیا، مشک و علم ہے خون میں جرار آیا، گورے سے گرا غازی پھر اسوار نہ آیا، مشک و علم کے بانی ہمارا سلام لو، چلو بھرا جو پانی دریا بہا دیا، کشتی تڑا دیا ہے، اے لنگر اسلام، اسلام کا یہ پرچم لہرایا خون سے تیرا، اے حامی اسلام، ہمارا سلام لو، پانی نہ چچا مانگو، تم لوٹ کے آ جاؤ، شدت نہیں ہے پیاس کی، امو میرے آ جاؤ، یوں خاک پہ تم لوٹ کے منہ کو نہ چھپاؤ، سقائے سکینہ تم ہمارا سلام لو، دریا کی موج دیتی ہے دن رات صدائے، صد مرحبا ہو تم پہ اے لشکر سردار، اونچا رہے علم تیرا، حسین کے غم خار وارث پہ سالار، ہمارا سلام لو، بالآخر آقا تمہارے قدموں کی خاک ہو نصیب، چومے زری ہم آپ کی کربل بھی ہو نصیب، پرچم کا سایہ ہوگا اے دل کو یہ یقین، اے وارث کونین ہمارا سلام لو، صلوات فرمائیں۔
Thank you to both of our reciters tonight. We are fortunate to have with us Dr. Ali-Reza Bhojani. Ali-Reza is a lecturer at the Al-Mahdi Institute, co-director of the Center for Intra-Muslim Studies, and a research affiliate at the University of Oxford. A graduate of the Al-Mahdi Institute, his research, teaching, and writing focuses on intersections between Islamic legal theory, theology, and ethics. He has a PhD from Durham University, and he has held academic posts at the University of Nottingham, the University of Oxford, and the Markfield Institute of Higher Education. Can we please welcome him with a salawat? Allah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين شفيع ذنوبنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبا القاسم محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا أما بعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم وهو الأصدق القائلين وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى, and that no soul shall bear the burden of another. وأن ليس للإنسان إلا ما سعى, and surely for humankind, for people, is only that which they strive for. وَأَنَّ سَعْيَهُ سَوْفَ يُرَى, and surely soon in the future he will see the results of his striving. ثُمَّ يُجْزَاهُ الْجَزَاءَ الْأَوْفَى, and then he will be rewarded a complete reward. وَأَنَّ إِلَى رَبِّكَ الْمُنْتَهَى, and surely to God is the ultimate destination. These verses of the Quran, which I've just recited, are found in Surah An-Najm. They end by saying that surely to God is the ultimate destination. And the story of this world, of the creation of our own existence, is nothing more than a movement towards God. Here we have an opportunity of moving consciously towards him, of choosing to fulfill our potential, a potential which is no less than divine, directing ourselves through ibadah, through service, or fulfilling that mandate of stewardship, khilafah, via developing a spiritual ethic within us, where the teachings of Islam aim to help us secure justice within, balance within the self, and balance within society, moving us beyond these basic demands for human morality and aspiring to those godly characteristics, the godly ethics of Ar-Rahman. This spirit, this ethics is of course most productive when built out of justified belief, where our accountability is in accordance with my own understanding of truth. And differences in belief may be a means for me to share and a means for me to learn. A justified belief that allows impact from these ideas and doesn't simply hang upon the tongue, such that it may inform me in my every interaction with the world itself, with my human community, amongst Muslims, and despite differences. Now, over the last 2 nights, we've moved from these theological foundations to start to speak about some of the mechanisms which Islamic teachings offer to help us in this journey towards God, to help us in securing this spiritual ethics, in helping us establish those relationships with other, to manifest those beautiful qualities of God. And we looked at a specific teaching, the particular example of the family relationships, of how maintaining family relationships, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, you maintain your relationships, you are connected with me. You break these family relationships, you have already lost me. Yesterday, we started to speak about the more general mechanism of this more inclusive idea of Sharia. And despite the emphasis upon Sharia within the spectrum of Islamic thought in present and in history, despite the emphasis having been disproportionate at certain times and in certain places, there is no doubt that the discourse of Sharia is pivotal and a critical element within the worldview of Muslims. Although the term is not used often in the Quran, the idea of regulations, of rules, of practices prescribed by God is without doubt something which is part and parcel of the Quranic worldview, as manifested in the prophetic message. Regulations, rules, practices which seek to take us somewhere. Remember, the Sharia as a word originally comes from the word that means a path. It's supposed to take you somewhere. It's not an end in itself. It's an instrument moving us ideally in the direction of the godliness which is already within. So these practices can be seen as technologies of the self through discipline, through repetition. We can cultivate character. Fiqh isn't intended to simply be for the discharge of duty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't need duty from us. If he gives us a burden, it is for our own benefit. Now, these practices, when embraced within a rational, moral, ethical framework with purpose, are of course geared towards and capable of moving us towards those godly characteristics, so vividly demonstrated in the likes of Muhammad Rasulullah and Hussain ibn Ali. These practices, often mundane, ritual practices, are capable of awakening our very being, awakening our very conscious. Because to awaken hearts and awaken minds was undoubtedly one of the aims of prophecy itself, one of the very aims of religions or prophetic messengers. In one of the opening speeches of the Nahj al-Balagha, Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi is reported to have outlined the purposes of prophecy. And within this list, he includes one of the purposes of prophecy to be لِتُثِيرُ دَفَاعِنِ الْأُقُولِ, to allow for the flourishing of the intellects which are within, to open the mind, to release human potential. This is where these practices are intended to take us. But when, through negligence, through inattention to God, through thoughtless practice, empty practice, we allow our minds to be dulled and our conscience to be dulled, surely we open ourselves up to damnation. Let me recount a scene reported from the day of Ashura. The day of Ashura itself. It is, of course, a heart-wrenching scene. But on another level, it is deeply profound. So it's reported, the tradition is reported in a number of different forms, in a number of different ways. I rely upon a report of Sheikh al-Suduq here. Elsewhere, before coming to the main body of the tradition, which is a speech attributed to Imam al-Hussain on the day of Ashura, on the morning of Ashura, it's reported that one of his companions, possibly Burayr, asked the Imam if he could go and speak with the armies that had been gathered before them. So as we know, on the day of Ashura, he had a small collection of people, family and friends of Imam al-Hussain, salamullahi alayhi, faced by, according to some account, an army of 10,000 plus. According to other accounts, an army of 100,000 plus. On the banks of the Euphrates, with that huge army, whatever its size may have been, it clearly outnumbered the size of those who were with Hussain ibn Ali. That huge army had restricted access of Hussain ibn Ali and his family to the water of the Euphrates. Now, on the morning of Ashura, it is reported that Burayr, or one of the other companions, asked the Imam if he could speak with the armies who stood before them. And he approaches them. The Imam al-Hussain gives him permission, says, go and speak. Burayr is reported to have asked them, he says that, oh people, do you not recognize that this is I'm paraphrasing here, do you not recognize that this is the grandson of Rasulullah? They said, yes, we recognize this is the grandson of Rasulullah. He says, and do you not see that this is the Euphrates, within which dogs and waterhounds drink. Yet you stand as a wall between him, the grandson of Rasulullah, and this water. They said to him, Burail, be quiet. You have spoken enough. Hussein will remain thirsty just as we have kept thirsty people before him. At this point, it's reported that Imam al-Hussein steps forth with his sword resting upon his sword, speaking out with the loudest of voices. فَنَادَى بِأَعْلَى صَوْتِهِ. He called out with the loudest of voices. And he said, أَنْشَدَكُمُ اللَّهِ. He says, I call you to the remembrance of God. By God. It's much more than wallah, actually. This anshadakum Allah says, I call you to be conscious of God. Hal ta'lamuna anni, hal ta'rifuni. It says, hal ta'rif. It says, by God, I call you to attention of God. It says, do you recognize me? The people replied, yes, we recognize you. You are the son of Rasulullah, and you are his grandson. Imam speaks again. He says, Anshadakum Allah. He said, I call you to the remembrance of God. Be conscious of God. Do you know that my grandfather is Rasulullah? Upon him and his family be peace. They replied, yes, oh God, yes. We recognize this. He says again, Anshadakum Allah. Hal ta'lamuna anna ummi Fatima binti Rasulullah. He says, I call you to attention of God. Do you know that my mother is Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet of God? They said, yes. By Allah, yes. He continues. He says, Anshadakum Allah. I call you to God. Do you know that my father is Ali bin Abi Talib? They replied, yes. And he continues. He continues and he continues. He calls them in each of these statements, which continue for some time. He says, Anshadakum Allah. I call you to remember God. Do you recognize me? Each time they said, by God, yes. Ultimately, after listing all of these, personal attributions, of Hussein ibn Ali, his relation to the Prophet, his relation to the daughter of the Prophet, his relation to the family to the Prophet. He goes thus far, he says, do you recognize that this is the sword of the Prophet and that the Prophet has given it to me? Do you recognize that this is the amama? This is the turban of the Prophet and I have been invested with it. They said, yes, we recognize this. It says, by God, فَبِمَا تَسْتَحِلُّونَ دَمِي. It says, by God, so why do you think, how have you made my blood halal for you to spill? How have you considered it permissible to kill me? Look, amongst the many things which could be said about this scene, something should strike us here. It seems in this, this toing and froing, Hussein ibn Ali is trying to evoke the consciousness of God into the decision-making processes of those who stood before him. Remember, each time, say, Anshadakum Allah, I call you to remember God. Do you see what you're doing? I call you to remember God. Look at the implications of what you're doing. How have you made my blood halal? He was seeking to bring personal conscience, personal accountability into the core of the decision-making process of those who stood in front of him, into matters of halal and haram, into the matters of the do's and don'ts of this religious tradition. When yesterday we called for the need to revive a rational, moral, ethical framework for Sharia, of course, this idea of a rational, moral, and ethical framework for Sharia is accepted within the Shia school and beyond, very, very widely. But the idea of the need for this rational ethical framework is often pushed onto the scholars, saying, look, thinking about the ethical framework, the rational framework regarding the practice of Sharia, this is for the mujtahids to deal with. They need to come up with rational rules, ethical rules. It's for them, those who are dealing with the difficult interpretation of text, tell us what is halal and what is haram. If that is so, what about the user on the ground? Is all this discourse about a rational framework, an ethical framework to Sharia, to Islam, is it just rhetoric? I think we can see from the statements of Hussain ibn Ali, absolutely not. He was calling those people to be conscious of God and ask their consciousness of God to inform their decision-making process on the ground, at the sharp end. Look at this beautiful tradition, widely reported in Shia sources, attributed to Imam Kadhim, salamullahi alayhi, the 7th Imam. It's also found in Al-Kafi. It's reported the Imam says, Inna lillahi ala nas hujjatain. Says, surely God has over people two sources of authority, or two sources of argument, two sources of evidence. Hujjat al-Dhahira wa Hujjat al-Batina. The apparent or the outer evidence, the apparent or the outer argument, and the inner or the hidden argument. For amma al-Dhahira, what's the outer argument and authority of God over people? For amma al-Dhahira for Rusul wal Anbiya wal A'imma. So this is the prophets, the messengers, and the imams. Wa amma al-Batina, what about the hidden, the inner authority of God over people? Wa amma al-Batina fal aqul. This is the minds. This is the conscience. No, the job of the jurist and the scholar is interpreting the heritage of the prophets and the imams. They deal with the text of the Quran. They deal with the sunnah of the prophet, the traditions of the imam, and try to infer the rulings to guide us, to take us in those technologies of the self for our cultivation. But this doesn't mean we ignore the inner evidence of God upon us. In the tradition, Imam Kazim didn't say, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى الْعُلَمَا حُجَّتَيْن. He didn't say God has two sources of authority or of evidence over scholars. It says, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حُجَّتَيْن. God has two sources of authority over people, the outer evidence and the inner. If this is the case, if, as we see, Hussain ibn Ali was trying to bring the consciousness of God into the decision-making process of people on the ground at the sharp end, he says, if you do so, it could have saved them from what was clear damnation. If we take those words of Imam Kazim as they seem to be, that all people have two sources of authority, the outer evidence and the inner evidence being their minds, their consciousness. If this is the case, how do we understand the dominant rhetorical framework, at least, which is informing Shia communities in its emphasis on taqleed? Are these ideas which I'm suggesting completely at odds with the mainstream popular view? I argue no. Look, I've mentioned this a few times in different contexts, that rhetoric is often so divisive. We live in polarized societies. Yeah, at every level, whether it's political scenes, whether it's in terms of Sunni Shia discourse, or whether it's even differences amongst Shias themselves. And yes, the rhetoric around taqleed is often very, very divisive. But I think if we look at the dominant theory, again, more closely, we can see that it has place. It maintains a space which certainly needs emphasizing and expanding for individual conscience and individual personal responsibility. Look at the juristic theory of Sayyid Sistani. Now, Sayyid Sistani, I'm referring here to his advanced Kharij notes. So this is his advanced lecture notes delivered within the city of Najaf some years ago. He discusses the very nature of taqlid. What does it mean? Just briefly, some comments here to try to make this case that when we look at taqlid carefully, this is not versus personal responsibility. This is meant to be a means to the fulfillment of personal responsibility. Nor is taqlid ever absolute. It can't override one's personal responsibility and personal call of conscience. So back to Sayyid Sistani's theory of taqlid. It says linguistically, what does taqlid mean? So he discusses how when we look back in the Arabic language, okay, and we look at the way these words have been used in Arabic literature and even in the hadiths, okay, attributed to the Prophet and the Imams, we see that we can find the word taqlid used in different senses. At one sense, a very literal level, it comes from the word to place something upon another. Okay, kallada safe, for example. And we saw that actually in the tradition. Okay, the Imam Hussain said, I am carrying the safe, I am bearing the sword of my grandfather. Okay, so sometimes we see that the word taqlid means to, place something upon another, else something physical upon another, like a sword or a garland. Okay, we could say we placed the garland upon another. Okay, kalladahu. Okay, we placed it upon. Another sense, and this is Sayyid Sistani discussing this. So another sense is we could talk about placing not something physical, but something abstract upon another. So for example, we may say, kalladahu, giving examples that he cited, kalladahu wilayatul buldan. Somebody has placed the authority to govern a city upon another. Okay, or we might say, I don't know, Sister Sumayya placed the responsibility on Sister Kaniz, okay, to manage this session today. Place the responsibility upon her. This is a form of taqlid, to place something upon another. When it comes to the taqlid of a mujtahid, Sayyid Sistani says it's not used in these senses of placing something upon another. He says no. Taqlid in terms of following of a mujtahid is a different sense. This is simply following the view of another. It's not placing anything upon the other. It's simply following an expert view. Now, Sayyid Sistani makes a big point of this because he's pushing back against views of his predecessors or some misconceptions which have come up from views of his predecessors. He wants to be very, very clear. This isn't reliance upon somebody else. It's simply reference to an expert view. Taqlid in its technical sense, okay, amongst jurists, he argues, is here. It says in matters of halal and haram, in matters of fiqh, is simply following the expert view of another. It is not shifting responsibility for action. That's the first thing. Okay, so this reference to experts is so that we may, or people may, discharge their own responsibility. You're not pushing anything on anybody else. Okay, it's just a reference to a source of expertise. What about the justifications for this practice? Because of course the mainstream wants to say this is a justified, legitimate, necessary practice in matters of Sharia. One needs to go through an expert. So of course, when we look at the rhetoric out there, okay, we may have heard many people citing verses of the Quran, like we see in Surah At-Tawbah. Okay, لولا نفر من كل فرقة طائفة منهم ليتفقهوا في الدين. Sayyid Sistani says no, these verses don't establish anything to do with taqlid. We might find variety of hadith cited. Sayyid Sistani says no, these don't establish anything to do with the taqlid of a mujtahid. None of these establish a justification for relying upon an expert to discover and disclose the rulings of Sharia. And this is consistent with the giants of the Shia Usuli tradition who preceded it. So if we look to a famous scholar called Akhund Khurasani, he said, look, any justification to rely upon an expert in matters of interpreting texts must be rational. It must be intuitive. Otherwise, we would first need to be an expert in the text before we can accept it. So the mainstream position is that the basis, how they justify why people should rely upon an expert to discover the nuances of Sharia, is what they call Bana al-Ukala. Now, Bana al-Ukala, okay, I feel is best translated as rational convention, ordinary practice. Now, this is the dominant position all the way from the likes of Sayyid Mohsin al-Hakim through Sayyid al-Khuwi to our contemporary Sayyid Sistani. He said it's normal, it's ordinary for people to refer to expertise in things they don't understand. Now, in matters of religion, we see to adopt this normal practice, to adopt a normal practice of seeking an IT specialist, yeah, or an engineer or a mechanic. Okay, Sayyid Sistani gives these mundane examples of a mechanic, for example. Yes, this is normal. And my car's not working. Okay, I go to a mechanic, for example. All right, so it's normal in ordinary convention when we don't know something to refer to experts. When it comes to matters of religion, the Quran doesn't reject this practice. And if it wasn't permissible to rely upon expert knowledge, okay, in matters of Sharia, surely we would expect Allah to have told us so. So accordingly, we actually find, this simple practice of relying upon an expert to find out stuff that we don't know about religion being a widespread practice amongst Muslims throughout history in slightly different forms. So we can ask again, is such a practice of relying upon an expert in tension with personal responsibility? Look, with this vision, absolutely not. It's not shifting of responsibility of the action to the other, nor is it a blind following. It's intended to be a justified reference to somebody else for the discharge of my own duty, right? The fulfillment of personal responsibility through reference to another. But we have to be honest. The rhetoric out there, the spiel, if you like, that we often hear about taqleed does seem to be in tension with personal responsibility and personal accountability, particularly when it comes to the question of the scope of this taqleed. Right? When should I refer to an expert? Okay, and is that expert's knowledge binding? Again, looking at the theory of the likes of Sayyid Sistani. So, in the very first ruling, which we find in his most developed Risala Amaliya, the Minhaj al-Salihin, his most extensive handbook of fiqh regulations, Minhaj al-Salihin, the first ruling, again, people may be familiar with this. It says, loosely translating here, okay, for the sake of time, يَجِبُ عَلَى كُلِّ مُكَلَّفٍ لَمْ يَبْلَغْ رُتْبَةَ الْإِجْتِهَادِ. It's a duty upon every religious, responsible person who hasn't attained this expertise themselves, okay, to be in all of their devotions and all of their transactions and all of their actions, either a follower or somebody who takes caution. This seems like it's absolutely total in scope. And this is often the rhetoric that we hear. All right, the one has to, in all their acts and all their omissions, not just their acts and their omissions, refer to an expert. Unfortunately, I think many of us haven't read the whole of this ruling. So Sayyid Sistani himself says, consistent with the tradition in which he's speaking, he says that yes, follow, refer in all of your actions, all of your omissions, except if you acquire knowledge that your action, so if you're sure, except if you're sure your act doesn't contravene a necessary ruling, or if the issue is amongst from those things which are surely known about religion, those things which everybody accepts, those things which are accepted within the school. And he says this is many of the wajibat, most of the mustahabbat are from what they call the daruriyat. These are things which are accepted. You know, our daily prayers or daily fasting or daily issues, these aren't contested issues. Sayyid Sistani is explicitly saying these don't fall under the remit of taqleed anyway. If we have knowledge, if they're from the daruriyat ad-din, from those things which are definitively known, matters of religion or the school, and we understand them through intuitive knowledge, or we've got them from an acquired sense of surety. These are beyond the scope of taqleed. So the established scope, according to the theory itself, is not absolute. Next question. Is it binding? Where there is a view of the expert, is it binding according to their own theory? Unequivocally, I will say no. The reason is that the same exemption which says that those things which are definitively known in religion, those things which you are certain of, are not included within the scope of taqleed. This is because ultimately we are accountable to our convictions before God. If I'm convinced that something is not correct, how can I stand before God having ignored my conscience? Even as a non-expert, if I'm convinced something is wrong, I can't cover my conscience. Hussain ibn Ali told those people on the battlefield, Anshadakum billah, I call you to be attentive to God. Think about what you're doing. Look, you cannot take personal responsibility and God consciousness out of the equation. Yes, to fulfill my personal responsibility in many circumstances pushes me to rely upon expertise, but never at the cost of the conscience. This journey is all about a personal, individual journey towards God, attaining a sense of God, which pushes us in our pursuit of truth, pushes us in our pursuit of belief, pushes us to always seek the best course of action. And as the Quran stated in the verses that I began with, Allah taziru waziratun wizra ukhra, nobody shall bear the burden of another. وَلَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. People will have nothing except which they strive for. In another version of that report of the very same speech I started with, Hussain ibn Ali is reported to have said to those people, says, فَانْظَرُوا, think, consider, هَلْ يَحِلُّ لَكُمْ قَتْلِي, is it really permissible to kill me? They had been told X was permissible. He's asking them to think right now, bring God into the equation. Their minds, however, were closed. Their conscience was silent. And the results were so brutal that it took from this world the fifth and final of those beloved Ahl al-Qisa. One by one, friends, families, companions, such that Hussein himself was left on the plains of Karbala, head severed from his neck. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah, wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik, alayka minni salamullahi abada, ma bakitu wa bakiya layla wa nahar, ولا جعل الله آخر الأهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He may enliven our minds, our hearts, our conscience, our practices may be a means of approach to Him, and that the efforts and the time and sacrifice by those who are listening and those who put these gatherings together may be accepted and be a means of approach to Him. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ahli bayti at-tayyibin at-tahirin.
Thank you, Dr. Bhojani, for another illuminating lecture and for examining personal responsibility. This principle of not ignoring the consciousness of God in our everyday decision-making is very important. For many of you who do not know me, my name is Talib Kizilbash, and I will be moderating the Q&A today. If you like, you can still submit questions via menti.com. The code is 25365869 and is on your screen now. Dr. Bhojani, we have a few questions for you today, so let's jump right in. This one says, would a rational ethical framework require an inclusive approach to its development? If so, then can the current process of Sharia development be flawed because it excludes the population of practitioners, i.e. women, whether racially diverse?
Beautiful question. So yes, I think a rational ethical framework demands an exclusive approach, demands an inclusive approach. Rationality, you know, traditional conceptions of rationality amongst Muslim scholars and pre-modern philosophers, why do you see rationality is something which is universal? Okay, and by necessity must be inclusive. Okay, the ethical frameworks which ordinary people recognize today to be a universal aspirations are absolutely inclusive. These are consistent with the Quranic framework. Okay, such as those statements which I mentioned a few nights ago, "Laqad karamna al-bani Adam." We have honored and dignified the children of Adam, whether it be male or whether it be female, irrespective of race. So yes, a rational ethical framework demands an inclusive Sharia. Does that require more plurality in those we rely upon to understand the Sharia? Absolutely. Absolutely. So there is no doubt we need more diversity in our scholarship. We need women's scholars, okay, who are being pushed and encouraged to do those things which are considered to be the hard, dry sciences, of fiqh, usul al-fiqh, legal theory, and it can be a hard grind, but absolutely we need more women, okay, we need more diversity, okay, in pushing themselves and supporting them to be trained to the very, very highest level, given the independence not only to be trained, but to teach, okay, in the directions which they see are necessary for the progression of this thought. But beyond scholarship, I think to develop an ethical, rational, reading of religion, or in particular its practical injunctions through this lens of Sharia, also needs more engagement by the users of Sharia, which are of course inclusive, right? So this isn't something which should be driven by scholars in an ivory tower. Okay, it absolutely needs engagement by those who are using on the ground. And I think historically and in the contemporary period, really the movements we see, okay, are from opinion-seeking Muslims on the ground. So we need to raise the voices, raise the conscience, raise the understanding, okay, of each and every one of us to become the changes that we seek.
Thank you very much. The next question, I believe, is from yesterday's topic. It says, the ambiguity in many rules can be frustrating and lead to conflict. Has the lack of black and white in Islam been a greater benefit by providing timelessness, or a bane by creating confusion for the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that confusion and doubt often gets a bad press. Right? So confusion and doubt can actually be a very, very beautiful place. Okay, because it can be an opportunity. It is an opportunity for growth. It's a point of humility. Okay, and it's an opportunity for growth. So even if we see the giant of monotheism, Ibrahim, salamullahi alayhi, he asks God, okay, he couldn't understand, how does God bring the dead to life? Kayfa tuhyi al-mawta, he addresses God. Okay, this critical, rational thinker, okay, who was promoting God. Still he had doubts, he had the audacity to ask God. Kayfa tuhyi al-mawta. Okay, Allah says, don't you believe? He said, no, I believe, but I'm not sure yet. My heart hasn't become settled. My heart is unsettled. He's a prophet of God. Right? So doubt, questions, ambiguity, these aren't necessarily problematic. These open ourselves up to the grace of God. They're a possibility for development. So I think that's an important premise. Of course, it doesn't mean it's not challenging to get over this doubt and ambiguity. Yeah, and has it been more positive? Has it been more negative? This would need like an empirical study, right? Which I don't have those tools, okay? Nor am I really a historian, okay? So I would like to focus on the hope and the possibility. Yeah? Is that, you know, there's clear hope, there's possibility. We shouldn't be afraid of doubt, and we shouldn't be afraid of ambiguity. As soon as you have ambiguity, it allows for human agency. Look at it that way. Okay, if something is not entirely clear, if it hasn't been given to us on a plate, this means I need to put something in. And actually empowering humans is what the story is all about. Yeah, as I mentioned, that tradition attributed to Imam Ali, لِتُثِيرُ دَفَاعِنِ الْعُقُولِ, to actually activate humankind. So ambiguity is a means to us, a platform for us. Yeah, we have to then pick up the mantle. Right, we have to make the effort on a very personal level, you know, through our daily struggles and our considerations and thinking, you know, actually having, this is not clear to me. That's a good place to be. It shows I've got a moral conscience. Should never dull that. You know, I should try to actually seek to facilitate that. Right? It means I care. It means I'm thinking. It means I'm concerned. I want to see, what does God want from me? What's the right thing to do? That's a beautiful place to be.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent perspective. I think we're running short on time, so instead of going over, I think we'll stop the Q&A for today. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Bhojani. As usual, let us close by singing a Surah Al-Fatiha for those who are no longer with us. Al-Fatiha.